Uh-oh.
I'm Nate Chesney. I'm here from MIT's endowment. My colleague Navneet Harikumar is here as well. I have two unrelated questions, but since there's two of us here, I'll ask them both. Both of them are designed to be sort of answered from first principles. It's not to be critical of any business in the portfolio today. The first is you've written thoughtfully about the difference between a sustainable moat and a growing moat, and that being a function of an innovative culture and an innovative management team. And I'm curious how you think about the inputs to innovation and how you think about underwriting innovation beyond culture and talented management. Also in the context that, and perhaps this is naive, but it seems that a lot of innovative companies work in very fast-moving industries, often technology. But how do you feel about the capacity to have certainty 5, 10 years out when innovation is a critical part of the thesis? So that's the first part. And the second is when you think about very mature businesses, take Facebook as an example, 380 billion market cap, a quarter of the world's population is counted among the monthly active users. I think it's like a $1.6 billion number. How do you think generally about the law of large numbers being a headwind to compounding and duration? Is it possible for Facebook to be a $1.5 trillion business, or Google and others? And how do you weigh that runway versus certainty when you're looking at larger companies?
Thank you. Two really great.
I'm gonna sit so I can.
Yeah, two really great questions. Yeah, so on the kind of the the question of moat and innovation, I think it's kind of almost stating the obvious, although it took me a while to get to it. But it's kind of, if you think about it, really not all that important whether a company has a wide moat or a narrow moat. It certainly needs a moat, but the really crucial thing is that moat kind of expanding faster than other people are filling it up, because I'm looking to be invested for a very long time. So even if a moat was only eroding at say 5% a year, that would still mean over 10 years or so, a large part of that moat has disappeared. So I really think the kind of that idea of widening is way more important than width. And that sounds kind of obvious, and I see some of you kind of nodding your head. But I think it's actually kind of fairly non-obvious, at least within the context of kind of the value investing literature and how a lot of value investors work. And I think the approach a lot of value investors take, which, by the way, of course, are the very finest investors, but is that innovation. Well, that's not really in my ballpark. That's something I don't really understand, and I'm going to leave to other people to worry about. I'm just going to focus on these sort of theoretically non-changing businesses, and leave the tough stuff to the other guys. And I think that's a problematic way to approach things, because I don't think there's too many businesses left that fit that criteria. Although, in fact, actually, the one we're at today, the Bergbahn, I think actually does fit that criteria. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine this mountain not being here, or people not wanting to go up it. So, there definitely are these kind of very unchanging businesses and moats, but there's not many of them. And of course, as we all know, the value creation in our society is not, it's not really coming from these small, companies like this one. It's really from some of the big tectonic changes happening in terms of the internet, mobile telephony, and artificial intelligence, I think, increasingly. So, I think, I keep an open mind about it. I'm happy to be invested in a Bergbahn, and I think it brings something to the portfolio, as it's a company that kind of takes the risk off the table of something being disrupted. But I think it's impossible to avoid some of these faster growing companies which are changing our society. It's tough to beat the market, and share prices follow earnings over time. So if the market as a whole grows at GDP, but within that there's companies growing at 10-20%, and then those shrinking or growing at 0%. You're making an already difficult task of beating the market even tougher by kind of taking out that universe of companies that are growing faster than GDP. So I think it's something that I've definitely decided for myself I need to pay a lot more attention to, and I think probably other people should too. Even if you decide not to invest in a Facebook or a Google, you better be making sure you understand what they do, because they have plans which affect the car industry, the insurance industry, media in any case. So what you think to be your nice, safe, unchanging businesses are probably going to be impacted anyway. So if you're going to look to those type of businesses, then of course there's always trade-offs to be made. So you could have some rapidly changing company growing at a breakneck pace, but where it has to kind of reinvent itself every 2 years on the one hand, and then at the other end of the spectrum there's companies which I think the moat is very established and unlikely to be breached. And the two tech companies we have in the portfolio are Alphabet, which we've had a long time, and Facebook. And I think the moat for both of those companies is enormous. I think it's growing, and I think it's incredibly unlikely that it's not going to be there in 5 years, or they have to do something unexpected within 3 years or 5 years to still have a moat. So within this sort of opportunity set of what you might call tech companies, I've tried to allocate our capital to the ones which I think are the most likely to have a sustainable moat, and ones which are certainly growing the moat. And that's maybe one of the trade-offs I made when I paid what many of you may think is a slightly high multiple for Facebook. So it always comes down to trade-offs, but I think it's a mistake not to pay a lot of attention to innovation.
And then on the law of large numbers being a headwind to really unusual compounding.
Yeah. Well, clearly you can't have really unusual compounding if a company is already the largest company in the world. But that aside, we've been invested in Google now for 5 years, I think, and it was already a big company when we invested. And if I'm honest, at the time it was growing at about 20% a year, and I would have assumed it was on some kind of a glide path down to more normal kind of revenue growth rates. And that hasn't materialized. I mean, the growth has been fairly steady at 20%, and if anything, is accelerating. It dipped a bit below 20% a couple of years ago, and they announced their full-year results a couple of days ago. And if anything, the revenue growth is accelerating, especially on a constant currency basis. So I think it's a mistake to think that the large companies can't compound at a very good clip. And especially if I compare that to the small cap opportunities in Germany, for example. So when I first started investing, my universe was mainly these sort of small cap German companies. I loved them then. I still kind of love them now. But even though they're kind of small companies, so you would think they have very long runways ahead of them, the reality is they're also addressing, for the most part, quite small markets, quite mature markets. And I can scarcely think of the universe of companies I know, and I know most of them. I can scarcely think of any of them which are growing sustainably above 15% a year. The one exception is Grenke Leasing, which we've been invested in since the very start of the fund, which is growing 15-20% a year. That's fantastic, but that's actually a pretty short list. So if people say the value creation opportunity is bigger in small caps than large caps, I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think there's opportunities in both spaces. And in terms of the size of the opportunity that a company like Google or Facebook has, there as well, I think people have really underestimated how these companies are expanding their markets. So one approach to YouTube is to say, okay, how big is the TV market, or TV advertising market rather. what kind of share might they be able to get of that, and then derive some kind of valuation from that. But that would just be a huge mistake. There's grandmothers in New Zealand advertising their knitwear and selling it to young mothers in Germany. This isn't displacing TV advertising. This is really increasing the pie for everyone. And I think there was a similar debate about Uber a few years ago. Someone said, listen, even if you assume they take the whole taxi market worldwide, you still don't get to where the valuation is. But as we now know, when Uber comes along, people start taking multiples more journeys for all kinds of different use cases than they did previously. So, Google often talks about just sort of scratching the surface of the opportunities in search and the opportunities for doing a better job and connecting more companies to users. And they've been saying it long enough and demonstrating it long enough. I believe them.